I'm thrilled that Bela has chosen to have this wonderful show at the library, and I'm especially thrilled that he came back to Cornwall, his hometown, after being in Sweden for so long, so that we get to see his work as it evolves. I'm sure a lot of people saw the show at Ian's and the show at Bianca's Souterrain Gallery, and each time it's evolved. It's a little bit different, and I think this show is so cohesive and so beautiful. But I wanted to tell you all about how he does it, which is pretty unusual. So the creative process is particularly unusual, and the work is so beautiful and so distinct. And anyway, we'll hear all about it from him, and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm, wow, a little speechless. It's nice to see you all here. Where should I start? So, hey guys. Let me start with the idea. So, I've been reading a lot of quantum mechanics, theoretical physics, that kind of stuff lately, trying to sort of get an understanding of how the universe is made and where do things like life come from, these sort of giant unanswered questions that, you know, aside from religion, there's no consensus on. We have something called the standard model of particle physics or something like that, you know, that it sort of explains like that everything in the universe is constructed of the same little tiny batch of subatomic particles. And scientists think we know more or less what most of them are, and there are theories on what a few more might be. But the very cool thing is it's like a half dozen little tiny things out of which everything in the universe is formed. So rocks and trees and people are all from the same tiny batch of ingredients arranged in slightly different patterns. And then there are various forces that hold these particles together and that push them away from each other, and just that, and they're in constant movement and flux. And when whatever, say that they've been turned into a human for a while, then time is another thing which we don't really have a pretty solid understanding of yet. But as time passes based on our understanding of it, those particles form a pattern and then they disperse again and they reform into something else after a while. So that's kind of the underlying thought behind all of this. And I was exploring the idea of using effectively shards of pottery as initially a metaphor for these subatomic particles, and using them to create different patterns. And then as these patterns are being created, they form into, there's this idea of complexity. So you arrange these things and they create, when you have more and more bits and pieces put together and forming a sort of cohesive unit, you get a complex entity of some kind. That could be something as simple as a human cell, which in and of itself is like this incredibly complex unit, which is it's virtually inexplicable to understand. How does that emerge? How do we get things like DNA and self-replication and the idea of life? So this metaphor from these little shards, it goes on to serve as a, when you have certain objects like these, that are more complex entities that are sort of represented. Everything is sort of metaphorical in this whole theme. This is referring to the time element. That's called eon. So it's an exploration from the subatomic level all the way up through complex entities, human beings, and when you have something like a human being running around, we have this thing called consciousness, which is also not very well understood, self-awareness, and things like memory and things like properties of complex organisms with a higher cortical functionality, which there's an evolutionary explanation for the emergence of these properties, but they also have side effects. So I'm also exploring things like isolation and depression and other sort of elements that less complex organisms most likely don't experience. So it's a little hard to find an evolutionary explanation for the emergence of these properties because they don't really necessarily serve, improve our ability to survive as a species. They're sort of like side effects. Where do those come from? So all of that is sort of the overarching theme of the show. And then the process itself is something called light painting. So each of these is a photograph, but each photograph is actually anywhere from 50 to 100 photographs. So the process involves me in a dark studio, which is basically a corner of my basement, with a camera fixed on a tripod. And I create one of these little collections, and organize all these metaphorical particles into a pattern, and set the camera to shoot continuously at 4-second exposures. So it's just running, taking one 4-second exposure after another. And during each exposure, I'm illuminating the subject with this little flashlight that I've attached a little attachment to that makes the beam of light, or the circle of light, this very tiny little circle. So there's for the smaller pieces, the circle of light is about the size of, about that big. So there's this little puddle of light. And for some of the larger ones, it's maybe the size of a hand. So for this one, for example, for each exposure, these shards are sticking straight up. I'll be shooting from over here. I'm moving the light during each exposure, moving the light over here. And you get these interference patterns where shadows cancel each other out as beams of light appear and disappear. And that sort of builds. So they have these layers of activity building over time, and just creating something. And then after I have 50 or 100 or however many exposures in the camera, I open them all up as a single image in Photoshop. And each exposure is a layer in that image. And then I change the settings so that only the lighter bits of each layer filter through to the layers below. And that's the case for every single one of the layers. So there's this cumulative effect that runs all the way through. And in the process, by doing it that way, I'm also introducing all kinds of artifacts which cause certain cognitive dissonance and things that, like, it takes a step away from what a straight up photograph would produce. You know, you're adding complexity and randomness and unpredictability to each image. And the end result is something that's closer probably to a painting than to a photograph, you know, but they are photos. So yeah, that's pretty much the way it's done, and that's what the thought process was behind it. And any questions?
Does everybody get it?
Oh, man.
Where comes your interest of the quantum mechanics?
I don't really know. I was just talking about that with Linnea, my lovely daughter over here earlier, about the core curriculum at the University of Chicago involved. I studied philosophy, that was my major. But because Chicago has a core curriculum, meaning that you aren't allowed to only study whatever your focus area is, you need to study things like sciences as well. I also studied a lot of art. So the science, one of the classes I took was called Physics for Poets, which is like physics for people who aren't really mathematically inclined. We talked about quantum mechanics then, and I was fascinated by just, you know, the uncertainty principle and then something called the double slit experiment, and the fact that light is both a wave and a particle, and all these different things, and that the atomic state of the state of a subatomic particle. There's this thing called quantum computing, which some of you I'm sure have heard of, which basically relies on the fact that any subatomic particle can carry multiple states at the same time. And someone explain this for me better than I can. There's
qubits.
Yeah, exactly. So these are called qubits. But basically, the act of observing a particle can resolve this multiplicity of states that it's carrying into one of them, and the other states sort of vanish at the moment you observe it. There's some extremely prominent theoretical physicists who posit that act of observation, and by observation it could mean actually measuring it in a lab, or, as I see it, any form of interaction with any other particle can resolve that state. And one of these theoretical physicists, who I quite like, but I don't actually ascribe to his theory, is that every time one of these, what's called a quantum superposition, resolves into a single state, a brand new universe is formed, where the other state winds up. So you have like this something
like parallel.
Exactly.
Parallel universe.
Yeah, it splits off a brand new universe. Like, that seems insane to me.
That's kind of fun.
There are other physicists who don't believe that theory at all, who who think that that it works an entirely different way. But the very cool thing is, like, all the top, most preeminent physicists in the world all have different ideas about how this very fundamental aspect of our existence works, and I find that utterly fascinating. So that's what I'm just reading about all that stuff and trying to sort of eventually arrive at my own conclusions. I haven't really arrived at any conclusion yet. I find it really interesting. The one that I find most appealing is something called loop quantum gravity, which kind of relates to my previous show, which was called relational mechanics, and that's based on the idea of relational quantum mechanics, which essentially says that reality is formed through the interaction of particles with each other. So that something doesn't even exist until something else somehow bumps into it. I'm not quite sure how it bumps into it if it doesn't exist yet, but somehow or other, it like pops into existence when that happens.
Entanglement.
Entanglement, yes.
Entanglement's a very interesting one.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's the word I was searching for. Yes.
Yeah, where they separate them, the same particle, and they accelerate one at a speed, a very high speed, and they change one, and the other one instantly changes.
Right.
And there's no way that could possibly happen based on our physics.
Exactly. It was meaning faster than light communication, which is not possible. But so that's
entanglement theory.
Yeah, spooky action at a distance, as Einstein described it, because he thought it made no sense.
There's a lot we don't know.
That's what I find. That's why I find this so fascinating, because it basically proves that we know effectively nothing about how the universe actually works. We don't know how consciousness works, or why we have it, or even if
what is.
What is it? So that's what the show's about.
In a nutshell.
It's also about beauty, I would say,
and
reclaimed objects, recycling from local workshops.
Right. Let me touch on that too.
Yes,
so all of the raw materials, as I mentioned, are like all of these little shards are bits and pieces that I scraped up from Todd Piper's refuse heap at the Cornwall Ridge Pottery. And all the bits of wood are from scrap heaps at Ian Ingersoll's workshop. So there's a metaphor in there as well in effectively, recycling and repurposing damaged and discarded objects, or objects that no longer serve their original function. I see that in some ways as a metaphor reflecting back on my own personal journey, which I feel like for many, many years I would describe myself as one of these broken bits of pottery, and I feel like I'm trying to recycle myself in the process, and hopefully emerge as something else. But yeah, my goal in creating all these is both to create something which is hopefully aesthetically at least interesting, and hopefully pleasing to some extent. Maybe not for everyone, but so that there's you can hopefully relate to them on an emotional or visceral level, in addition to considering the underlying thought process behind them. So that's what I'm trying to sort of hit both of those as best I could. Yes.
So you're one of my favorite artists, because I appreciate, and I mean this, because the way you approach your art and photography through science and physics, but from the perspective of art, is the same way that I approach poetry, which is really interesting. It's almost identical. And when I did the same thing with radio, called the I Do Not Know Show. So I think everyone here should value that art like this, and I'll come to a question, is really important, because in a way it's already about what we don't know but should know, but where only creativity can go. And so it's very valuable. So I appreciate that you're doing what you're doing and the kind of art you pursue. So, but my question was, you mentioned time, and that we don't know what time is. But then when you mentioned the layers, you mentioned the light comes through. So in a way, how did you choose, when you were setting the filters, why did you choose light to be the one thing that allowed to end up in the Photoshop thing?
Well, I mean, that's
light and time.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the only way to make it work visually, is to let the light bits filter through. But it does touch on an interesting aspect of neurophysics, which there was a guy who's unfortunately not here today. I was hoping he might come. This neurophysicist who I met at a different opening, and told him that I was doing this. I didn't know he was a neurophysicist, but I told him that this was the theme of my next show. was like, oh, wow, I just wrote a paper on that same topic a few years ago, and his paper was about the idea, well, they were trying to isolate where consciousness lives in the brain. And so there's an image over there called dendrites, and I've forgotten the full term. It's a type of dendrite. It's anyway this little thing that I don't even know if what you'd call it, like this little phalange or something that in the brain we have millions of them.
It's not the neurons that
top
connect to
neurons.
each other. It's like
Yeah.
a little tail, like
It's
they connect to each
apical dendrites.
other. Yeah.
Anyway, his paper was about the fact that they think that consciousness, at least it exists, or evidence of it exists in the activity of apical dendrites in the brain. And that activity is electromagnetic. It's light. So that basically the little, I don't know what you want to call them, beams, although there's like light activity, sparks shooting in your brain. And that's where this awareness of self and this awareness of the world around you comes from,
Yeah.
which is kind of cool.
There's
too.
two
So-
ways they can connect. They connect, through the neurons and the dendrites with electricity, and when they connect, that's chemical. So chemical, or in between the dendrites.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
cool. Yeah. So all of this, thank you. All of this stuff is stuff I barely scratched the surface of any of this. That's why my explanations are very flimsy, because you really need to know a topic well to be able to explain it, and I don't. But I have a stack of books at home that I'm working my way slowly through and and then rereading them because they're complicated.
If it makes you feel better, the physicists don't know either.
And that's also the very cool thing of this process, that it's sort of the intellectual process that I'm going through, that's sort of reflected into this show, is that since I did study philosophy 35 years ago, 40 years ago now, and then I didn't really explore it for a long time, and so much of theoretical physics effectively is philosophy at this point. These theories there are all these competing theories out there. Particularly things like this multiverse theory and whatnot is impossible to prove. It's by definition impossible to actually prove. It's untestable. So it enters the realm of philosophy. You can make your best guess. You can have your arguments, and you have your Bayesian probability underlying. This has the greatest likelihood that this theory is probably correct based on the available evidence. But that's it. It's only a likelihood. It's only a probability. And probability is another interesting aspect of this topic. Because once again, by shooting these 50 exposures and 100 exposures on a given image, it's basically a sequence of interactions of light and subject that cumulatively produce an effect, and that's sort of like the effect of a number of small probabilities producing a final result. I don't think I quite got that, but you know what I mean. It's like probability and chance and randomness are fundamental to all of this, and they're fundamental to, based on our best understanding of quantum physics, fundamental to all of us, and actually everything in the universe is based on probabilities and randomness and constant motion. Yeah.
I have a question. When you're lighting, taking all the separate individual photographs, what is your thinking, and what are you trying? Are you trying to illuminate the object for form giving, or is it something else? Form negating? I mean, I don't know. So I'm curious as to what's your
Intention.
intention of this dance with light within the still life.
Yeah. A little bit of both. It varies a bit from image to image. One of the things I'm usually going for is to trying to bring out textures just so like when I'm illuminating the wood here, I'll be doing it at a very low angle to the wood to sort of make sure that the structures, the grain, will be as visible as possible, sort of trying to create dynamism. And then in some of them, the intention here, for example, is to create partly an impossibility. Light is coming from behind, where all of that wood is. This is actually not physically possible based on the image. You know, there would be a bunch of light sources exactly where this wall of wood currently exists. It's also creating paradoxes, and then sometimes I'm going for dramatic shadows and edges and that kind of thing, and other times going for a more sort of like in these. Other times going for a calmer, more harmonious effect, where here I'm just aiming, and this is basically exploring the weight of time. And since it's also a cross-section of a little shard, this actual shard is about this big. You sort of get this feeling of sediment and of sort of, you know, a cliffside building up over millennia, that kind of, you know, feeling. So it varies a bit from motif to motif.
So I guess most of the time you keep the tripod stationary, but do you change vantages sometimes?
Yeah, for each image, the tripod is it's stationary the entire time.
For this as well?
Yeah, but also some of them are flipped upside down or sideways, because I'm also sort of exploring, well, partly because I think it makes it more interesting, and some of them are like, you know, there are some of the images, I think they're in the next room, where you have like pots flying at an angle. You know, the way to do that was to shoot them the other way, upside down, with a piece of wood at an angle, and the pot's hanging straight, gravity, and then flip them upside down,
and then change it.
Then they're suddenly swooshing off to the side. But it also connects to this idea of the way we experience the universe, and the idea of up and down is purely a construct that we use to be able to navigate in the world that we inhabit. You know, the only reason this feels like down is because there's gravity, you know, pulling me in that direction. But in the universe as a whole, there is no such thing as up or down, you know. So it's sort of separating down a little bit from our experience of the world to the world as it is, which in and of itself is something that doesn't necessarily exist. You know, I mean, it's hard to say. There's no actual clarity on what actually exists. You know, it's another one of these things, which is a collection of probabilities and interactions. And
Thought that this morning.
Well, the good news is that you're more Nikola Tesla and David Bohm than you are Oppenheimer. So this is art, not a bomb. So thank you.
Bela, quick yes or no question.
Yes,
All
sir.
your photographs, have you ever gotten a picture of Schrodinger's cat?
not yet, yeah. I keep opening the box and,
There's cats to offer.
you know, in my day job, I lead a team of software developers, and it's called a Scrum team. It's this particular kind of software development technique. And when you form a new team, the team has to come up with a name. And I sort of casually suggested Schrodinger's cats as the name of the team, and that's the name of my team.
Thank you so much, Bela.
Any other questions?
Great talk.
Thank you.